Lena Whitmore didn't expect her Friday night to include rescuing a stranger from a date that looked like it was spiraling into disaster, but then again, she didn't expect a lot of things that happened that night. She was halfway through her burger at the Garden Room, the trendy rooftop spot in downtown LA, when she noticed the man at the table across from her. It wasn't his looks that caught her eye, though, to be fair. He was stupidly handsome with messy dark hair and a jawline that didn't quit. It was the way he looked completely cornered. The woman sitting across from him was talking at full speed, gesturing wildly with her wine glass, and the man looked like he was trying to disappear into his seat. Lena leaned toward her best friend, Jenna, and whispered, "That guy's about to fake a phone call or leap off the roof." Jenna snorted into her drink. "He's hot, you should go save him," Lena laughed, wiping her mouth with a napkin. "Yeah, right. Like I'd walk up to a random table and pretend to know him." The woman across from the man suddenly slammed her wine glass down. The man flinched. Lena's instincts kicked in. Something about his eyes screamed, "Help me." Before she could think twice, she stood up, walked straight across the rooftop, and slipped into the empty chair beside him like she belonged there. "There you are," Lena said, grinning like she'd known him her whole life. She put her hand on his arm. "Sorry I'm late." Traffic was a nightmare. The man blinked. Then, like he'd caught on, he turned to the other woman and said, "Sorry, this is my girlfriend. I didn't think she'd make it." The woman's face twisted. "Girlfriend, you said you were single." Lena raised an eyebrow. "I am very much not single." "And he definitely didn't tell you that." She gave the woman a tight smile. "Blind dates are the worst, huh?" The woman stood up, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off. Silence. Then the man burst out laughing. "Oh my God, that was wow." He turned to Lena. "You just saved my life," Lena grinned. "You're welcome." She looked like she was about to set you on fire. "I think she might have tried." He extended a hand. "Harrison Pierce." "Lena Whitmore." She shook it. His handshake was firm, warm. "Can I buy you a drink to thank you for that Oscar-worthy performance?" She tilted her head. "Only if it comes with fries." He laughed again, and Lena didn't miss the way his eyes lit up when he looked at her. A waiter came by and he ordered 2 glasses of Cabernet and a basket of fries like he already knew what she wanted. They talked for over an hour. It was easy, too easy. He was charming, but not in the fake way. He listened. He asked questions. He made her laugh until her stomach hurt. And not once did he check his phone. When the waiter brought the check, Lena reached for her purse, but Harrison slid a platinum card across the table before she could blink. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He leaned back in his chair, looking at her like she was the most interesting thing in the world. "You didn't have to rescue me, but I'm glad you did." They walked out together. LA was warm, the sky full of stars. At the curb, a black car pulled up before Lena could order her rideshare. "You have a driver?" she asked, surprised. He hesitated. "Something like that," she smiled. "Well, Mr. Something Like That, thank you for the wine and fries. Thank you for saving me from being emotionally waterboarded." They stood there for a moment. Then he said, "Can I see you again?" Lena hesitated. She wasn't the kind of girl who got swept up in one-night rooftop meet-cutes, but something about him, his smile, his eyes, the way he listened, made her want to know what came next. "Okay," she said. "One real date. No rescue operations," he grinned. "It's a deal." She gave him her number and walked off feeling like the universe had just handed her something completely unexpected. 2 days later, Harrison picked her up in a sleek black car that practically purred. He didn't say where they were going, just told her to dress nice. She wore a simple navy dress and heels, and when he opened the door for her, his eyes lingered. "You look beautiful," he said softly. They ended up at a restaurant she'd only ever seen in magazines. Le Jardin. It had gold chandeliers, a string quartet, and a dress code that probably cost more than her rent. The maitre d' greeted Harrison by name. Lena leaned in. "Okay, who are you?" he chuckled. "Just a guy who likes good food." "You know the chef," she teased. "He owes me a favor." Over oysters and truffle risotto, they talked about everything: her job as a graphic designer, her obsession with old movies, his love of architecture. He didn't talk much about his work, just mentioned he had a few companies. After dinner, they walked through a sculpture garden lit by fairy lights. He took her hand and she didn't pull away. "This is the best date I've ever been on," she said without thinking. He smiled at her. "Same." They stopped by a fountain and he looked at her like he wanted to say something but didn't. "What?" she asked. "I'm just glad you showed up that night." She squeezed his hand. "Me too." By the time he dropped her off, Lena's heart was pounding. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want the night to end, and when he leaned in and kissed her, slow and soft, she kissed him back. She spent the rest of the night wide awake in bed, wondering what just happened, and how it was possible that she already wanted to see him again. What she didn't know, what he hadn't told her yet, was that Harrison Pierce wasn't just a guy with a driver and a taste for expensive wine. He was a millionaire, and falling for her fast. Lena adjusted the strap of her camera bag as she stepped into the sun-drenched atrium of the Bellamy Gallery. The morning light bouncing off marble floors and cascading through the towering glass ceiling. She was there to photograph a new installation for a freelance project, her day job. A patchwork of design gigs and occasional photography assignments that paid just enough to keep her in overpriced coffee and second-hand books. As she focused her lens on a suspended steel sculpture, her phone buzzed in her back pocket. She hesitated, then pulled it out. "Are you free for lunch?" Harrison's voice was warm and low on the other end. "I'm about 5 minutes away from a place I think you'll like." Lena glanced at her schedule. "I'm technically working. I'll make it worth your while." She rolled her eyes, but her mouth twitched into a grin. "You'd better." 20 minutes later, she found herself stepping into an ivy-covered courtyard tucked behind a bookstore in Westwood, where Harrison was already standing under a white canopy, holding 2 iced lattes and wearing a navy button-down rolled at the sleeves. "This place is adorable," she said, sliding into the wrought iron chair across from him. "How did you even find it?" "I used to sneak out of board meetings and hide here," he said, handing her the latte. "The owner's my godfather. He used to pay me in biscotti to shelve books when I was a kid." Lena took a sip. "So you were a rebel with a taste for caffeine and literature? And you were a rooftop heroine with a perfect sense of timing," he said, leaning forward with that quiet intensity that always made it hard to look away. "I still owe you for that," she raised her brow. "You've already fed me oysters and truffle risotto." "I'd say the debt's settled." "Not even close." Their conversation drifted effortlessly from Lena's current photography project to Harrison's recent trip to Kyoto for a client meeting that turned into a week-long architectural tour. He mentioned a fascination with minimalist design and how he once convinced a Tokyo firm to swap an entire facade of concrete for glass. She listened, fascinated not just by the story but by how he told it like every detail had weight, every decision a heartbeat. "Wait," she said suddenly, setting down her latte. "You said client meeting. What exactly do you do?" He paused just long enough for her to notice. "I own a few companies." "Mostly investments," she tilted her head. "What kind of investments?" "Startups, real estate, a couple of tech platforms. It's not exactly cocktail conversation. Try me." He studied her for a second. Then he said, "I'm on the board of a firm that developed an AI system for emergency response routing. We sold a controlling interest last quarter." Her eyes widened. "That's actually really cool." "I thought so," he said, reaching for his drink. "But most people just ask if I'm into crypto." "You don't strike me as a crypto bro." "I take that as a compliment." They walked through the bookstore after lunch, and Lena watched him run his fingers over worn spines like he was searching for something he'd once forgotten. He pulled out a vintage copy of The Little Prince and handed it to her. "Because you see things differently," he said. She held the book to her chest, caught off guard by how personal it felt. Later that week, Lena's apartment buzzed with the scent of burnt toast and frustration. Her landlord had finally agreed to replace the ancient radiator, but the contractor had knocked out part of the wall in the process, and now her living room looked like a construction site. She was mid-sweep when a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Harrison holding a garment bag and a small velvet box. "Are we robbing a boutique?" she asked. "You're coming with me to a fundraiser tonight," he said. "Black tie." "I figured I'd save you the trouble of digging through your closet or pretending to own a gown." She narrowed her eyes. "You're awfully confident I'd say yes." I brought chocolate, he added, holding up the velvet box. It was a truffle sampler from a Swiss chocolatier she'd once mentioned in passing. She stared at it, then back at him. You remembered that? I remember everything you say. The gala was held at a glass-domed conservatory on the coast. Dozens of chandeliers glittered above, and a string ensemble played something haunting in the background. Harrison was pulled into conversations every few minutes by CEOs, donors, and people who clearly knew exactly who he was. Lena stayed close to the edge of the room, sipping champagne and trying not to look out of place in the emerald satin gown he'd brought. Every detail fit perfectly, from the subtle beadwork at the waist to the way it moved when she walked. She wondered if he'd had it custom-made. When he returned to her side, he slid his hand along the small of her back. Sorry, that was a nightmare. I'm guessing you're not just a guy who likes good food. His jaw tightened slightly. I was hoping I could be for a little while longer. She turned to face him. Why? Because when I'm with you, I'm not someone people want something from. I get to just be. She hesitated, then said, Is that why you didn't tell me who you were? He nodded slowly. I didn't want it to change the way you looked at me. She looked at the way his tux clung to his frame, how his eyes searched hers like he was waiting for the verdict. It doesn't, she said finally. Relief flickered in his expression, and his hand tightened slightly on her waist. They danced. Slowly at first, then not at all, because somewhere between the music and the soft glow of the hanging lanterns, they simply stood there holding each other, like the illusion of being alone in a crowded room had become real when they left. The night was quiet. He didn't take her home immediately. Instead, he drove along the cliffs until they reached a private overlook with a view of the entire coastline. She stepped out of the car, the hem of her gown brushing the gravel, and he joined her in silence. I come here when I need to remember what matters, he said. And what matters now? He looked at her. You, she turned to him, heart hammering. Why me? Because you didn't care who I was, because you made me laugh when I wanted to disappear, because you make everything feel different. She touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. You scare me, he blinked. Why? Because I wasn't looking for this, and now I can't stop thinking about you. He kissed her, then not tentative, not careful. It was the kind of kiss that erased everything else. Her fingers curled into his lapel, and he held her like he was afraid she might vanish. When they pulled apart, she was breathless. He rested his forehead against hers. I want more, he whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. But as she lay awake that night, her fingers still tingling from his touch, a thought crept in. What if this was too perfect? What if too many differences still stood between them, waiting for the right moment to break them apart? She didn't have answers yet. But she knew one thing for certain: Harrison Pierce wasn't just a man who had been saved from a bad date. He was a man who could ruin her carefully built walls. And maybe, she was starting to hope he would. Lena's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but the Adobe Illustrator project in front of her remained untouched. Her apartment, still cluttered from the impromptu radiator demolition, felt too loud, even in its silence. She'd been trying to finish the logo commission for a boutique wine label all morning, but her focus kept drifting to the man who had just last week kissed her like she was the only real thing in an unreal world. She couldn't shake the memory of Harrison's mouth on hers, the way he'd said she made everything feel different. And now she was staring at a blank canvas, trying not to wonder what came next. Her doorbell rang. She blinked, startled. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, a deliveryman handed her a narrow black box with a handwritten envelope affixed to the top. Lena opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a note in blocky, slanted handwriting. Thought these might help with your next project. Inside the box were 5 vintage fountain pens, each one a different color and etched with delicate filigree. She turned one over in her palm, stunned. She didn't even remember telling him she collected antique pens. A few hours later, Harrison called. I have something I want to show you, he said. She hesitated. Is it another secret garden with $1,000 wine? His laugh on the other end made her stomach flip. No, but I think you'll like it. He picked her up in a matte silver coupe she hadn't seen him drive before. Lena noticed the way the interior smelled like cedar and worn leather, Not new car sterile but lived in, like memories had settled into the seats. She didn't ask questions. They drove through winding hills until the city disappeared behind them, replaced by open fields and a road that led to a gated estate. The gate opened without him needing to stop. Past the hedges and olive trees, there was a house, a modern marvel of glass and stone perched on the edge of a cliff. It overlooked the ocean, but the design made it feel like it had grown out of the land itself. "Yours?" she asked, stepping out into the warm breeze. "For now," he said. "I built it during a time when I needed solitude more than anything. I haven't shown it to anyone in over a year." Inside, the house was filled with light. The ceiling soared. The walls were smooth concrete softened by warm wood panels and shelves of books and art pieces that felt like part of the architecture. She walked through the space slowly, running her hand along the banister of a floating staircase, taking in the way the ocean glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You designed this?" she asked. He nodded. "Every inch." Lena stopped in front of a massive charcoal sketch framed in the hallway. It was of a woman standing alone at the edge of a rooftop, her face turned toward the city, her hair windblown but defiant. "This looks like me," she said. Harrison stepped beside her. "It is," her breath caught. He continued, voice low. "After that first night, I couldn't get the image out of my head, you, standing there like you belonged exactly where you were, saving a stranger without flinching." She turned to face him. "You sketched me from memory." "I didn't mean to." "It just happened." She stared at him, heart pounding. "Harrison, this is—" "I know." He reached for her hand. "There's something else." He led her through a side door and down a path that opened into a sunken courtyard. At the center, under a canopy of white lanterns, was a dinner table set for two. Candles flickered, and the smell of roasted garlic and rosemary lingered in the air. "You cooked?" she asked, stunned. He pulled out her chair. "I had help. But I picked the menu." As they ate sea bass with saffron potatoes and grilled asparagus, he asked about her childhood. She told him about summers spent in her grandmother's attic, helping her restore old photographs and falling in love with images that told stories without words. He asked about the first time she ever felt proud of her work, not just good at it, but like she'd made something that mattered. "No one's ever asked me that before," she said, swirling her wine. "I want to know everything," he replied. When dessert came chocolate tart with sea salt and caramel glaze, he didn't take his eyes off her. "Lena, I know this thing between us is moving fast," he said quietly. "But I've spent years surrounded by people who only care about what I can do for them. The night I met you, I finally understood what it meant to be seen." She didn't answer right away. She felt the weight of his words settle over the table like another course, heavier than the others. She thought of every time someone had overlooked her, every time she'd been dismissed at meetings or talked over by clients who assumed she was the intern. And yet, here was a man who had built empires and homes out of stone and silence, telling her that she mattered. "I don't want to be a momentary distraction from your world," she said. "I don't belong in it." "You don't know what my world really is," he said. "Then show me." He stood and reached for her hand. "Come with me." They climbed the staircase to the second floor, where the hallway opened into a studio. The space was filled with light and canvases, some half-painted, some leaning against walls, some covered with drop cloths. There were sketches, blueprints, even architecture models made of glass and wire. Lena stared. "You're an artist." "I used to be," he said, "before everything else took over." She walked toward a canvas that showed a man sitting on the edge of a balcony, head in hands, back to the viewer. The brush strokes were wild, stark, but the emotion was unmistakable loneliness wrapped in elegance. "You still are." He turned away, almost embarrassed. "I haven't shown anyone this room." "Why now?" "Because you're the only one I want to let in." She crossed the room slowly, touched the edge of a canvas. "You hide this part of yourself." "I have to," he said. "In boardrooms, in negotiations, there's no room for vulnerability. But with you, I don't want to pretend." She looked at him then, really looked at the man who had once needed rescuing and the one who now stood before her, offering her a truth no one else had ever been allowed to see. "I don't need any more grand gestures, Harrison," she said. "I just need this. Honesty, realness, you." He stepped closer. "Then you have me, completely." She kissed him not out of impulse this time, but because something inside her had shifted and she knew this wasn't just the start of a romance. It was the beginning of something deeper, something that demanded more than charm and champagne. When they finally parted, he whispered against her skin, "I've never let anyone this close." She rested her forehead against his. "Then let's see where it goes." The moonlight filtered through the glass walls around them, casting soft shadows over the room filled with forgotten dreams. And somewhere between the silence and the promise of what came next, the last of Lena's walls began to crack. But neither of them knew yet that something was coming, a truth buried under layers of omission, a piece of Harrison's life he hadn't meant to keep hidden. And when it surfaced, it would force them both to confront whether love built this quickly could survive the weight of everything they hadn't said. The ballroom buzzed with the sound of clinking glasses and polished laughter, every inch of the rosewood grand glittering beneath the shimmer of thousands of suspended orchid petals. Lena stepped through the arching entryway, her heels tapping against the marble floor, her eyes adjusting to the golden hue of candlelight reflecting off crystal. She had never seen anything like it. The gala was a benefit for a preservation initiative, something Harrison had mentioned once in passing, but the scale of it was staggering. She hadn't expected to receive a formal invitation with her name embossed in silver, or to be led to the front table by an event coordinator who greeted her like she belonged there. But the moment she entered, heads turned, not because she was famous or powerful, but because she was with him. Harrison stood near the raised dais, speaking with a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a Forbes cover shoot. His tailored tuxedo was midnight black, and his expression lightened the instant he saw her. He crossed the floor effortlessly, a subtle urgency in each step, and offered his arm without hesitation. "I was starting to think you'd changed your mind." "I almost did," she admitted. "Then I figured I should see what kind of man throws a party inside a floating garden." He leaned closer. "The kind who wanted an excuse to see you again." They didn't linger at the edge of the room. Instead, he guided her to a glass terrace that overlooked a reflecting pool filled with floating lilies. The air was cooler out here, scented faintly with jasmine, and something sharper, maybe the night-blooming vines that coiled up the terrace railing. Lena folded her arms, half to steady herself, half because something in her chest had started to turn over. "You've never looked more like yourself than you do tonight," he said. "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "It is. I see you, Lena. I see your fire, your stillness, your chaos, all of it." She turned to face him, eyes narrowing slightly. "Then why did I hear from someone else that you're selling your company and disappearing to Europe in a month?" His expression didn't falter, but something in his stance shifted. She didn't need him to answer. The silence was confirmation. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I just didn't know how. And what? Hope I'd be fine with it, that I'd wave from the airport and wish you bon voyage." "No," he said, stepping closer. "I hoped you'd ask me to stay." Her breath caught. "That's not fair." He reached for her hand, but she pulled it back. "This isn't about asking," she said. "It's about choosing. You say I see things differently, but maybe you don't see me clearly at all. I'm not someone who fits into a pocket between business deals and travel itineraries." "I never wanted you to be," he said, his voice lower now. "I wanted you to want this on your own terms. Then you should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth." He didn't respond right away. The wind moved between them, soft but certain, like it was trying to carry away the tension gathering in the space between their bodies. "I've been running for a long time," he said finally. "Each time I build something, I start planning the exit. I thought it was strategy, but I think it was fear of staying, of being known. And now I don't want to leave." "Not if it means losing you." She stared at him, searching for any hint of performance, any echo of practiced charm, but there was none. He looked raw, unmasked. "I need to believe that you won't disappear the second things get hard," she said. "Then let me prove it." She didn't answer. Not then. Inside, speeches began. Applause roared, but Lena stayed on the terrace, alone. The next day she didn't hear from him. Nor the day after that. By the third, she'd convinced herself that maybe this was his pattern. Build, bolt, repeat. She threw herself into her work, took on 3 new design clients she hadn't planned to accept, and told herself she didn't care that her phone stayed silent. But on the 4th day, just as dusk settled in and the city lights began to blink on one by one, a car pulled up to her building. It wasn't one of Harrison's usual sleek, anonymous vehicles. This one was a vintage roadster the color of aged copper, with a folded letter tucked beneath the windshield wiper. Her name was written in ink she recognized instantly, deep blue, exactly the shade of one of the fountain pens he'd given her. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers. If you want to know the truth, meet me at the place where silence lives. She didn't need directions. The house on the cliff was quiet when she arrived. No staff, no music. Just a trail of lanterns flickering along the path that led to the studio upstairs. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing louder than the last. Inside, the room glowed with amber light. Every canvas had been turned outward, dozens of them. Paintings of moments she hadn't realized he'd captured her reaching for a book, laughing with her head thrown back, walking barefoot along a fountain's edge. At the center of the room stood Harrison. He didn't speak. Instead, he turned over one final canvas that had been hidden beneath a cloth. It was a portrait not of her, but of the two of them. Standing together on the rooftop where they'd met, her hand on his arm, his gaze locked on hers. The background was a blur of city lights and shadows, but the connection between them pulsed from the canvas like something alive. "I painted this the night you left the gala," he said, "because I realized I didn't want to build a life you could visit. I wanted to build one with you in it." She stepped closer, her throat tightening. "I'm not leaving for Europe," he continued. "I finalized the deal, but I'm staying. I started a new foundation here focused on preserving local arts and supporting independent creatives. I want to fund studios, scholarships, exhibitions. I want to help people like you make things that last." She stared at him, stunned. "You're doing this for me. I'm doing it because of you. You reminded me what it means to create for the sake of something beautiful, not just profitable." "I forgot, Lena, until you walked into my life." Her eyes burned. "What if I'm scared? So am I." He stepped forward slowly until the space between them dissolved. "But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." She looked up at him, and something inside her finally broke open. "Then don't ever run again. Not unless you're coming with me." She laughed, then cried, and when he kissed her this time, it was not a promise of escape or illusion. It was a vow to stay rooted, to build something that didn't need to be hidden behind glass or guarded by silence. Later that evening, he led her to the terrace, where a small table had been set beneath a canopy of hanging lights. No orchestra, no curated menu, just 2 bowls of pasta and a bottle of wine. They ate with their shoes off, toes brushing under the table, telling stories they hadn't dared to share before, and when the moon rose high above the ocean, he stood and extended his hand. "Dance with me, Lena." "To what?" "To the sound of everything we've survived." She took his hand. And for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't saving anyone, she was choosing him. And he was choosing her without hesitation, without conditions, without an exit strategy. Because sometimes the most unexpected love isn't the kind that sweeps in with fanfare, it's the kind that stays. Lena pressed her cheek to Harrison's shoulder, the late spring breeze curling around them as the last notes of their slow, barefoot dance drifted into the night. The hanging lights above the terrace flickered low, casting a soft glow across the ocean beyond the cliff's edge. She could still feel the echo of his words from earlier, the way he'd said he wanted to build a life with her in it, not beside it, not visiting. In it, she pulled away just enough to look at him. "Can I ask you something? Anything?" "Why painting?" "Out of everything you could have done, why was that the thing you buried the deepest?" He took a breath and folded his hands behind his neck, stepping back to lean against the terrace railing. "It started when I was a kid. My mother used to do watercolors, tiny ones, on scraps of paper. She'd paint quick scenes from her garden, mostly. She called them little memories. I'd sit beside her and try to copy what she did, and eventually I started making my own. When she died, I stopped." Lena moved to stand beside him, fingers grazing his. I didn't even realize how much I missed it until I picked up a brush again after our first date, he said. It felt like I was waking up. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The quiet between them wasn't empty, it was full of understanding, of everything they didn't have to explain anymore. He turned to her. I want to show you something tomorrow, her mouth curved. Another secret wing of the house. No, his voice dropped a little. Something bigger. The next morning, Harrison picked her up in a different car, this one, a deep forest green classic convertible he said had belonged to his grandfather. They drove east, away from the coast, through winding back roads that eventually led to a high bluff overlooking acres of sprawling land dotted with wildflowers and clusters of trees. A small lake shimmered at the center. Lena stepped out and looked around. Where are we? I bought this land 5 years ago, he said. I was going to build a retreat center here, something sleek, modern, another investment. She turned to him. But now, he said, I want to build something else. Something that matters. He pulled a rolled-up blueprint from the backseat and spread it across the hood of the car. Lena leaned over it slowly. This is a community studio, she asked, tracing the lines, with artist residencies, a gallery, workshops. I want to make it free for anyone who needs it, Harrison said. Especially young artists who would never get access to something like this otherwise. I already have the funding. I just need someone who understands the heart of it to help me bring it to life. Her eyes lifted to meet his. I want you to design it with me, Lena, everything. The branding, the space, the visuals, all of it. She stared at him, heartbeat thudding. You're serious, completely? I've never done anything on this scale, I know. That's why I want you. You don't look at things the way other people do. You see meaning in the details. You give things soul. She looked back down at the blueprint, hands trembling slightly as she touched the edges. I don't know what to say. Say yes. She laughed under her breath, overwhelmed. You're giving me the chance to build something that could actually change lives. He stepped closer. You already changed mine. They spent the rest of the day walking the land. Harrison showed her where he imagined the main building would go, how the light would hit the glass walls in the morning, where he pictured the artist's cabins nestled beneath the trees. She sketched ideas right there on the back of the blueprint with a pencil she found in the glove compartment, her mind racing with possibilities. That night, they returned to the house on the cliff. Lena was barefoot again, curled on the sofa in one of Harrison's oversized button-down shirts, her hair still damp from a quick shower. He handed her a mug of tea and sat beside her, watching as she marked up the blueprint with color-coded tabs. You know, she said, not looking up, this feels like a life, not a moment. He reached for her hand. That's exactly what I want it to be, she hesitated. I love you, he didn't flinch. I've loved you since the night you sat down at my table and saved me from a woman with too much wine and zero boundaries. She laughed. I'm serious. So am I. He set his mug down, stood, and walked out of the room without a word. Lena blinked, confused, until he returned a moment later with a small velvet box. No, she whispered, heart pounding. He dropped to one knee. I wasn't planning on doing this tonight, he said, but I've never been more sure of anything. You walked into my life when I didn't even realize how badly I needed someone to see me. You challenged me, inspired me, made me remember who I really am. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, unlike anything she'd ever seen, a delicate gold band with a single vintage cut sapphire encased in swirling filigree, elegant and bold and entirely unexpected. Lena Whitmore, he said, will you marry me and spend the rest of your life making beautiful things with me? Tears blurred her vision as she dropped to her knees in front of him. Yes, she choked out. Yes, yes, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, slow and deep, anchoring her to the moment like it was the only truth that had ever mattered. They didn't rush the wedding. Instead, they spent the next year building the studio. Lena took on the creative direction while Harrison handled the logistics, funding, and architectural oversight. They fought, they laughed, they created something that felt more like a legacy than a project. The grand opening of the Solace studio fell on a warm summer evening exactly 1 year after Harrison's proposal. Artists from around the country attended, and the first exhibit featured Lena's own collection, a series of mixed media portraits titled Uncovered, inspired by the people who had found themselves through art. After the speeches died down and the last of the lights dimmed, Harrison led Lena to the back garden, where a string quartet played beneath a canopy of blooming wisteria. There, under the stars, they exchanged vows in front of only 20 people, family, friends, and the first cohort of resident artists who had become something of a family themselves. Lena wore a simple ivory dress with no embellishments, her hair pulled back to reveal sapphire earrings that matched her ring. Harrison wore a linen suit and no tie, his eyes never leaving hers. "I promise to never build anything that doesn't have space for you in it," he said. "I promise to never let you forget who you are," she replied. They kissed to a round of applause, but the world narrowed to the feel of his arms around her, the certainty of his heart beating in time with hers. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, they lay in bed in the small cabin they'd built just for themselves on the edge of the studio property. The windows were open, and the night air carried the sound of crickets and distant laughter. Lena traced the outline of Harrison's shoulder with her fingertips. "Do you ever miss the old life?" she asked. He turned to her, eyes soft. "Not for a second." They fell asleep like that, tangled in each other, surrounded by the life they'd built together, not of escapes or illusions, but of truth, art, and the kind of love that grows roots. And somewhere just beyond the windows, the wind moved through the trees, quiet and sure, like it knew it had finally found home.